All right, everyone. Wrap up your conversations. I love to see that everyone has gotten to know each other and that you're having such rich conversations that you don't even want to stop. I'm so glad. But hopefully this conversation is good too. So, all right. So this afternoon we are welcoming these panelists for a conversation about unraveling theological violence to weave a vision of wholeness. So we've had Bible study, we've had conversations about theology, and we want to dive a little bit deeper into that, understanding what is it that Christian theologies, because there's more than one, Christian theologies justify in terms of violence, but also offer in terms of frameworks to create justice and a world that where all people can flourish. So I am just going to let the panelists introduce themselves briefly. Say your name, your pronouns, and maybe what brings you to this panel. And then I will ask the first question.
Thank you, Ailey. I'm Luther Smith. I taught at Emory University's Candler School of Theology for 35 years and have been retired for 11 since then. My primary work began on Howard Thurman, a 20th century mystic who is quite relevant today in terms of realities, and have focused on issues of matters of faith and community. And my latest book is entitled Hope is Here, which is about spiritual disciplines for justice and beloved community.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Dee Roberts, and I use she, they pronouns, and I am the reference and outreach librarian at Pitt's Theology Library at Candler School of Theology at Emory. Long-winded title. But I am here in my capacity as a steering committee member of the Palestine Justice Network of the Presbyterian Church USA, as well as on the leadership team for the Institute for the Study of Christian Zionism, which is a project housed under Friends of Sabeel North America. So that's why I'm here.
Hello, everyone. My name is Noelle Heatherland. I feel most affirmed by they, them pronouns, and I am the statewide organizing manager for Georgia Equality, which is the state's leading LGBTQ+ advocacy organization. I also assist with faith-based organizing through that organization, but for today, I am primarily here as a person who is a survivor of a white Christian nationalist cult called the Institute for Basic Life Principles, which uses theology to be violent, notably against women and queer people.
Hi, I'm Avery Arden, and I use they, them pronouns. I just want to say I already love this group. You know you're in a good place when someone mentions Howard Thurman and you get cheers. I am a board member for More Light Presbyterians, which is a queer self-advocacy organization in Peace USA. I also do a lot of sort of online ministry, mostly around transgender theology and praxis and disability theology and praxis.
Wonderful. Thank you all. So our first question is to everyone. Words matter, and the way we name things matters, because they create theological frameworks that justify violence or lead to just ways of being. What gets called violence, and what gets called peace? And in each of your areas of expertise, how does a Christian theology perpetuate these definitions? And I'd love to start with Noelle, and then go to Dee, and then go to Luther, and then Avery. And I can remind you of that order.
This is such a great question. So I'll start by saying in my work at the Georgia State Legislature, we see this a lot. where Christian nationalism has really invaded politics, and that's not by mistake, that is by design. Growing up in IBLP and Teen Pact and fundamentalist Baptist churches and things like that, it was with intention to have Christian nationalism come into politics and take a leadership role in our country. So without diving too much into that, for now, I'll just name that has been a plan, that has been a strategy. So I'm really glad to see people here, especially people younger, who are really interested in understanding how do we prevent that, how do we correct course on that. So thinking back to even this past legislative session, one of the things I've noticed is whenever you're trying to advocate for yourself, whenever you're trying to protect people, there are people that will actually call that violence. There was a particular bill introduced in the Georgia legislature, SB 443, which is naming that being in the streets to blockade during a protest is something that is now illegal. So does something being illegal, does that become violence? Does shutting down a street become violence? So there are people that would say that it is, but when we look back in the civil rights movement, we know that we don't have the civil rights that we have today without taking certain actions that would be labeled by some as violent. So I think just introducing this question is really important. I also think back to, in my own experience, my own lived experience, is we talked a lot about peace. In fact, one of the things we had to memorize in the IBLP was Matthew chapter 5, the Sermon on the Mount and the Beatitudes. We had to recite that regularly. And one of the ways they twisted that was, blessed are the peacemakers. And I'll give, nothing is going to be super graphic, but a little bit of a trigger warning that one of the things they taught to people like myself growing up was that as a person who was navigating life as a woman at the time and still very much but is adjacent to the womanhood experience, we were taught as women, as people who were born female, that if we were raped, if we were assaulted, if we had those types of acts done to us, which I think most people in this room would agree are violence, that in order to be peacemakers, our job, our expectation, according to the theology that was being taught, was to accept that willingly, to accept that quietly, to be the peacemaker in that situation, that was the will of God. And so I know that can be really uncomfortable to hear. It's even uncomfortable for me to say, but I think for some of us, we may not even know that there are people having those experiences in the name of Christianity, in the name of religion. And there is a large group of people that were not just in the cult, but that were still exposed to that, even in more mainstream religious environments. And so their ideas around what is violence and what is peace is very confused and conflicted. And so I want to go ahead and pass it to Dee to dive into that a little bit more, but I just want to name that defining our words and understanding when we're in a room of folks in Christian settings and religious settings that we can be coming into contact with folks who have a very wide array of ideas around what is violence and what is peace. And I'm glad today to know that it is not violent and it is very much living in accord with peace for me to speak up and use my voice and encourage others to do the same for their own well-being. And that's really what peace is to me, is doing what needs to be done to protect those who are marginalized, to protect the vulnerable, to stand up for those who aren't always having their voice amplified.
Yeah, thanks, Noelle. So I think when it comes to demonstrating the importance of language and how we're naming and calling things, one of the best things in the present moment I can think of is the usage of the term conflict to describe the imperial violence that's occurring in the region that's known as the Middle East, in historic Palestine particularly. And so using the word conflict to describe the realities on the ground in Palestine creates a false equivalence between occupier and occupied. It suggests that there's a balance of power between nuclear-armed Israel and the Palestinian resistance fighters who are armed with rocks and very outdated weaponry. Right. I'd also like to problematize the term Middle East. because it begs the question of middle from where? Well, middle from London, right? And so Swana, Southwest Asia and North Africa, is a much more authentic term for the region that we commonly know as the Middle East. The term Swana is meant to replace Eurocentric misnomers like Middle East, Muslim world, and Arab world, and instead functions as a more neutral geographic descriptor of the region. So while here for centuries, in a post 9/11 world, there's a tangible presence of anti-Swana racism. A racism that is rooted in the intertwined legacies of Orientalism and colonialism, the latter of which has been amplified by Zionism. This form of racism has collectively racialized the region and its diaspora as a threat to the civilized world. And what do I mean by civilized world? I mean the white Western world. So you don't have to look very far to see depictions of Arabs and Persians as terrorists. You see it in movies, you see it in TV shows, you see it in literature, and you see it in handwritten middle school yearbook notes that happened to a mutual friend of mine. The very word terrorist itself is also a colonial term, as Western powers use terrorism to label and delegitimize indigenous revolts or nationalist resistance in the territories that it occupies. One person's terrorist is another's resistance fighter. In her most recent book, Gender, Genocide, Gaza, and the Book of Esther, Engaging Texts of Terrorism, Dr. Sarojini Nadar discusses the framework of what's called the sacred economics of violence. This expands on David Chidester idea of the political economy of the sacred by emphasizing how religion not only operates within economic, political, and symbolic systems, but also how it actively conspires with patriarchal, ethnic, and imperial forces to sustain systems of violence and hierarchies of power. So our current globalized reality has been shaped by systems of Western greed that are inexplicably linked to the Christian doctrine of manifest destiny. A really, really bad theology. It is no less part of our past and very much still a part of our present. Starting with Constantine, when the Western Church began to support the just war theory that saw military aggression against non-Christians as an essential part of evangelizing. Since then, we've seen the Christian faith distorted and used to justify cruelty towards other human beings, both here and abroad. This just war concept has been used to give theological cover to every single settler colonial project throughout history, from the foundations of what is now known as the United States or Canada to lands now called Australia or Israel. Now, Christian Zionism is the foreign policy manifestation of Christian nationalism. Christian Zionism teaches that the secular state of Israel is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. William Blackstone, a Chicago evangelist, published a book called Jesus is Coming in 1878. 1878. And this best-selling book sold many Americans on the idea that in order to hasten the return of the Messiah, a new Jewish state was needed. Christian Zionism holds that when the Messiah returns, in the Last Judgment, the Jews will have the chance to convert to Christianity, or they will be condemned to the fires of hell for all eternity. So it in itself is an inherently violent and extremely anti-Jewish theological framework. Yet, Jewish political Zionists and Jewish political Zionism has become bedfellows with Christian Zionists because they know that without Western financial, social, and theological support, the Zionist project will crumble. So while it's important to note that Zionism as a political ideology is different from the religion of Judaism, it's also equally important to acknowledge that Christian Zionism predates expressions of modern political Jewish Zionism by about 300 years. Palestinian liberation theologian Reverend Dr. Mitri Raheb, a good friend of mine, refers to this as the software of the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So to sustain its illegal occupation of Palestine, Israel relies on two things: hardware and software. The hardware is the weapons and other forms of military aid that are sent to Israel, and the software is the theological messaging that manufactures consent for Israel's many war crimes, including ongoing forced starvation, displacement, and bombing of children, women, and men in Gaza, throughout the West Bank, in occupied East Jerusalem, in Iran, and now in Lebanon. In just the past few days, the capital city of Beirut was bombed over 100 times in 10 minutes, killing over 350 people and injuring upwards of 1,500 more. Whether it be in Rafah, in Bethlehem, in Manab, or in Beirut, it's the same theological cover. It's the same incorrect language and naming that has created the necessary justification and manufactured consent that allows the majority of Christians in the West to ignore the suffering of our Swana siblings.
Thank you, Dee. In this first session of two, I want to speak to this matter of clarifying terms and where we locate ourselves in them. And in the second, speak directly to what difference does it make for us in terms of affecting change. Martin Luther King Jr. used the phrase, we have to be careful about the paralysis of analysis. And we get our terms clear, we have some insight on how they evolved. We find ourselves better at arguing, but we're not involved in changing very much. And I want to speak to that at the second part. Sacred scriptures have always been contentious. And I think we will find ourselves disappointed when we think if we go into the Bible and identify what this means, we have the upper hand. It's always been contentious. And I think it's a note of reality and not just a note of cynicism to say it will always be contentious. I think forensic argument does not make the case in a closed way. But it is important for us to understand what are biblical narratives about justice? How do we understand the prophets? As we get into understanding biblical narratives, what are they in terms of violence? And I would say there's a text for everyone when you get into the biblical narrative about how violence corrects injustice or how violence sets about the order for peace. But how do you engage the text in a way that is, I think, not just significant in terms of the biblical way of understanding who God is in terms of action. Walter Brueggemann, Old Testament theologian, is very helpful in saying, even in the Psalms, when you get this narrative about what will happen not only to those who have violated you, but what should happen to their babies being bashed up against the wall. Brueggemann is really clear that so much of the Psalms are expressing authentically what we feel emotionally, our anger, our hatred, and to recognize that and to speak it is part of the therapeutic process for going beyond it. And it's Brueggemann's contention, it's not every scholar's contention, but it's Brueggemann's contention that it's God who is the one who acts on these matters of violation, and it's not our license to take these matters into our own hand and make the corrections that somehow or another prove satisfying, at least temporarily. So it's important for us, I think, to study persons like Walter Wink, who provides some insight on ways in which we engage the biblical text with a commitment to enacting justice and peace. The terms of righteousness, the terms of evil, the terms of oppression are all there to be argued, and I would say are all there to be lived. And what too often gets ignored is a term like forgiveness, which is essential to peace. It's essential to peace. And you don't break generational cycles of genocide without attending to this question of forgiveness. I'm almost 80, and in the life of the church, I've never been taught how to forgive. I've been told to forgive, but I've never had a lesson on how to forgive. I've been told to pray and love for my enemies. I've never had a lesson on how to pray and love my enemies. So it's these dimensions of how we engage, I think, even these basic understandings, convictions, tenets of our faith perspective, how seriously are we attending to them such that matters of forgiveness are available to us for the kind of creative work that is needed for peace. And I'll just add, I heard a preacher on Matthew 5 say, Jesus really wasn't speaking about what we should be doing here on earth, because who can do that? And his interpretation was, this is how we react when we get into heaven. And too easily, persons dismiss what Jesus has to say, what the prophets have to say, what the text itself is saying for us, and what the text is saying about God. And I think this matter of really rooting ourselves in sacred text will be crucial, but it's important to remember it's never done once and for all. Even at this age, the text is alive. And something you've understood for 50, 60 years, all of a sudden you get a new insight on it that takes you, because the text is transforming you, and it's not just a matter of how we transform the text.
Oh my goodness. I have things I wrote down to say, but it's so hard not to just respond to so much of what y'all have been saying. I was also thinking about the concept of forgiveness, and language, and what we call forgiveness, and how it is treated as abstract, and who is pressured to forgive, and what is the responsibility of the one who did harm. And one passage I think about, and of course I forget where it is in the Gospels if anyone wants to name it, but when Jesus talks about, if you are headed to the altar and you're about to make a sacrifice and you remember that you're angry with one of your siblings, leave the sacrifice at the altar. God doesn't want it until you've gone and begged for forgiveness. And the way he words it makes it clear that the person he's talking to is the one who did the harm, right? That it's the person who did the harm whose responsibility is to act. But I won't go into too much about that, because I also want to talk about just, along with words like forgiveness and peace, I also think about how the idea of love is used, especially in the context of queer folk. How what is some of the harm done against us is done in the name of love, and the hardest part for me is that a lot of people genuinely think that what they're doing is love, when they send their kid off to conversion therapy and they say, it's hard for us too, but we're saving your eternal soul. And they believe it. And I never know how to fully contend with that, except to seek out and act out other ways to describe love, right? And just to say, like, I think about, like, the term love the sinner, hate the sin. To me, that is an almost blasphemous statement, because it's taking things that bear good fruit in the world, this queer love and these ways of questioning the status quo and breaking out of the ways that society tries to restrict all of us and all our different bodies and minds. To call that sin is, that to me, that is a great sin against God. If God is love and you're calling your hate love and other people's love hate or brokenness or sin, that's something to contend with. But yeah, also just questioning how we speak up against those things. Because like you were saying, we can learn the words to win arguments, but really you can't always win the argument even with the most eloquent statements and all the learning. So yeah, I'm kind of currently bringing more questions than answers to the table, but just being able to name where hate is being called love, or where violence is being called peace, I think is really important in terms of Jesus saying, blessed are the peacemakers, right? I'm sure some of you have heard of this, that he said peacemakers, not the peacekeepers, right? In order to make peace happen, there has to be things, the injustices need to be called out and overturned. Keeping the peace is keeping the status quo. And that's not what we're called to do, but it's what a lot of us are told to do. A lot of disabled people are expected to be happy that they managed to get into the church building and they're allowed to sit in the pews. A lot of trans people are too, right? Like, oh, stop worrying about everyone. Like, yeah, they don't get it. They're getting your pronouns wrong all the time, but like, you know, we're not kicking you out. We say that God loves you. So isn't that good enough? But it's not good enough until we're also in the pews, right? Until we're leading classes. And until every kind of person has an equal place, not just in the pews, but at the table. And I do think the power of words is there, that learning to be more deliberate with our language and call violence what it is and call peace what it is part of it. There's a book I just finished reading and I keep thinking about. I imagine you might have read it, Perfect Victims by Muhammad Al-Kurd. Excellent book. If you haven't heard of it, I highly recommend Perfect Victims, because it talks a lot about the power and the impotence of words. And one of the main things that Al-Kurd talks about when he's talking about, who gets called terrorists, and why when we're trying to defend Palestinians or black people killed by state violence or immigrants being detained, why do we choose arguments that, oh, but don't worry, they were a loving father, or, you know, they weren't one of the ones that were throwing stones, or, you know, they didn't have a weapon. Yes, that's often true, but what about the ones who did fight back? What about people who are killed by state violence, who are kind of cruel? They're not nice people. They still deserve to live. And so just, again, thinking about the arguments we make and the appeals we make, and resisting the need to be respectable when we talk about things, to say, to sort of throw out the question of, okay, well, were they innocent? Did they deserve this? To say that's leading us down a direction that's not going to help. But yeah, that's all I got. Sorry, it's a little disorganized.
Thank you, Avery. And I love what you said about not having anything to do but to react in the way, or act with how we know how to love. And I think part of what we're doing here is thinking about like alternatives, you know? We know how to do things, and we should just do things the way that we know, love the way that we know how to love. I like that. So in the next question, is in the US and around the world, we are introduced at an early age to a false binary between the religious sphere and the political sphere. Our conversation has already shown how intertwined these two aspects of our life are in our society, and we've talked a bit about it already this weekend. But my question is, what limitations does this binary place on transformational work? And how can a better understanding of religion's influence in political and social life strengthen that work? And I'd like to start with Avery, and then move to Dee, and then Noelle, and end with Luther.
You get to hear from me again. So politics in the most like narrow definition of the term is not my forte, so I'll leave a lot of that to the other folks. But yeah, the idea of separating politics or religion, I mean, an example of how that is very much not the case, right? That we do live in a Christian nationalist country. For me, one of the most blatant examples of that in the current day is all of the anti-LGBTQ and especially anti-trans legislation that's getting proposed and sometimes shot down and sometimes passed. Just at the end of March, the Supreme Court voted in favor of a Christian therapist in Colorado who does talk therapy. That is essentially conversion therapy, where she is using talk therapy to help young trans people, and also young other queer folk become, straight and cisgender. And her argument is that, this is her freedom of speech. As a Christian therapist, it's her freedom of religion to be able to just talk to them, right? Against the question of, do words have power? She says she's just talking to them. That's not conversion therapy. It doesn't count, right? And the justices voted 8-1 on her side. So she is going to be allowed to conduct conversion therapy. And to me, it's so blatantly about this certain flavor of Christianity, because all of the medical science is on the side of saying no to conversion therapy. Both in the US and across the world, medical science, it all agrees that conversion therapy doesn't work. So even if you wanted it to, even if you thought that was a good path to take to try to make people cisgender and straight, it just straight up doesn't work. But also it is much more likely to lead to self-hate and suicidality than it is to lead to any kind of good fruit. But yeah, when the science is against it, there's no justification for it except for faith, or for claiming that it's just words in this case. And again, thinking of perfect victims when he's thinking about the power of words, one thing I wanted to name that has to do with politics as well is he kind of talks about how the power imbalance between the words of the oppressed versus the words of the oppressors, and also the actions of both, right? That you brought up Psalm 137 with would that we could, bash the babies of the Babylonians, to kill them the way they killed our children. That is a wish that has no power behind it, right? It's violent, perhaps, but there's no actual power to enact that violence. And it's the same when different oppressed groups today are talking about their anger or even hate towards the oppressor. There's not actually the power to back that up that the oppressor has. And yet that's what tends to get focused on is, look, they said they hate us, see, they want us all dead. Well, even if that's true, they don't have the power to do that. Right. So yeah, just politically, I think when the words that get used to sort of get things going. But another thing that I'm not sure if y'all are gonna bring up, because talking about the sort of connection between politics and religion in a bad way, right? That we're claiming, separation of church and state when it's clearly not true. But also thinking about the combination in a good way that, and I think about liberation theology in Latin America during the 60s and 70s, when a lot of it started with Catholics, Catholic clergy, and other Catholic leaders who, up until the 60s, the idea was, okay, well, the church is in charge of souls, and the state is in charge of the body. So the state, we don't get involved with politics. We let the state do what the state's going to do, and we'll just take care of people's souls. But as violence and oppression increased at that time, including the violence of people being disappeared in the night, well, how do you take care of someone's soul when they've been disappeared? You don't have access to them anymore. And so they started realizing, and they started drawing from things, a lot of leftist politics like Marxism, to say, oh, we need to completely change how we're looking at how we take care of our people, and to say, maybe it is political. If caring about people's material situation on earth is political, then yeah, maybe Christianity does need to be political, but not in the same way that it too often is.
Yeah, I'm glad you went there. I think to answer this question, first I'm going to do some deconstructing, and then we have to reconstruct, right? And so walk on this journey with me. So when Christianity was tied to empire back in Constantine's time, the faith was intentionally linked to the political power of imperialism. And we see the damaging effects of this in every corner of the world that Christianity has touched, in how faith-based values influence political ideologies, social policy, and governance. Just one example that I'd like to highlight is Project Esther. Project Esther is a document written by the Heritage Foundation that sort of acts as like an addendum to Project 2025. Now, Project Esther has been coined, quote, a national strategy to combat anti-Semitism, unquote. Now, what it really is a right-wing plan to criminalize, defund, and dismantle U.S. civil society organizations that support Palestinian human rights, and to suppress any speech that is critical of the state of Israel on university campuses and elsewhere. So, this is a weaponization of anti-Semitism, where instances are being weaponized as false claims of anti-Semitism by labeling any critique of Israel as terrorism. So it's a mechanism to suppress any dissent against Zionism. Now, according to a now very dated analysis by Politico that was published in April of 2025, of the 47 points within Project Esther, 27 of them have been already actualized in public policy decisions across the country. Now, this type of faith-based rhetoric doesn't just show up in legislation, right? It's also disseminated orally. So a couple weeks ago, in an interview with prominent right-wing American commentator Tucker Carlson, who, just to be perfectly clear, isn't an ally to the movement that's rooted in intersectional liberation, just to be crystal clear there. But Tucker Carlson was interviewing U.S. Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee, who suggested that Israel has a God-given right to the land stretching from the Euphrates River to the Nile, which would encompass modern-day Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and parts of Saudi Arabia. This Christian Zionist theology is routinely preached from pulpits across the country in both conservative and liberal contexts. Just to burst a bubble, Walter Brueggemann is a massive liberal Christian Zionist. It happens because a false equivalence is being made between the biblical tribes of Israel and the modern-day citizens of the state of Israel. The two are not coterminous. They do not mean the same thing or talk about the same groups of people. Just a few weeks ago, U.S. military leadership is claimed to have said that the current U.S. and Israeli aggression against Iran is part of God's plan, and that President Trump was, and I quote, anointed by Jesus to light the signal fire in Iran, to cause Armageddon and mark his return to earth, unquote. Similarly, in a sermon given by John Hagee, who's the founder of Christians United for Israel, On March 1st of 2026, Hagee conveyed the same message when he said, quote, God Almighty is brought onto the battlefield, and the enemies of Zion and the enemies of the United States can be destroyed before our eyes, unquote. This language is not biblically founded, as it conflates a people of a 20th century nation state with communities written about in the Bible, which was a work compiled in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Nor is this rhetoric a rhetoric that supports the destruction of our enemies in line with the teachings of Jesus. So, Christian Zionism is antithetical to the gospel narratives. Now, it's not hyperbole to say that I went to seminary and became a leftist. So, having to critically engage with biblical scripture, read alongside folks from a multiplicity of backgrounds and life experiences, forced me to begin the process of learning a lot of really bad and harmful theology. In all 4 gospel narratives, we learn about a Jesus who flipped the tables in the Jerusalem temple. A dramatic act of righteous anger towards the money changers and dove sellers set up in a house of prayer that was turning into a den of robbers. The deliberate actions of Jesus, including this particular anti-capitalist action, led to his murder at the hands of empire and in the end to him dying for his friends. Now, do these things sound like apolitical acts to you? Absolutely not. Following Jesus has never been apolitical. As South African theologian and another good friend of mine, Dr. Ntando Mlambo, says, it is important to, quote, place Jesus exactly where he was in the Bible. Right. To spatialize the Bible, making it clear how power moved within the Bible, and to place Jesus's movements and how intentional they were, and the words said into context to make it clear that these weren't just simple movements, but that they said something, unquote. We need to have a suspicious hermeneutic or interpretation of scripture and ask the questions of what is happening, why is it happening, and who is being oppressed. 3 questions that you can ask yourself when you're reading scripture, if you do, is first, how do you read the Bible? Second, with whom do you read the Bible? And third, whose interpretations of the Bible do you engage with? Now, as a librarian, I often tell folks to read the same news story from no less than 3 different perspectives. And I recommend the same for scripture. So yeah, I'll stop there because I could go on and on and on and on this.
Thanks, Dee. I always love hearing your thoughts. You're one of my favorite people to listen to, especially when it comes to the challenges within Christian Zionism and for a free Palestine. So thank you so much for those thoughts. So I'm going to share some positive news because I know not all of you are here from Georgia. Some of y'all are from other places. So I want to share something with you if you haven't heard. So first of all, I would love to be able to say we passed 30 pieces of pro-LGBTQ plus legislation. We're not quite there here in Georgia yet, but what we did do is the conservative, mostly Christian, white Christian legislators introduced 15 anti-LGBTQ plus bills this past legislative session, which in Georgia runs from January to this year ended April 2nd. And Georgia Equality and other advocates and activists defeated every single piece of anti-LGBTQ plus legislation. Thank you. So the reason I want to share that with y'all is because part of our team that helps us defeat that type of oppressive, to me, I would posit violent legislation is clergy, is pastoral students, are faith organizers. And so I want to really make sure y'all hear that because I know Luther brought up it's not just about defining the words, it's not just about talking, it's also about taking action, it's also about what can we actually do, those steps that we're taking to create peace. And growing up, I was in a Team PAC teen leadership school, and also, the IBLP, as I mentioned. And part of what they were training the youth, the young people, the kids growing up in this, is to take over the world for Christ. And by Christ, they mean white Jesus. They mean Christian Zionist Jesus, their version of Jesus. But it was very much taught to use Jesus to take over the world for Jesus. But really what they were saying is, we're going to convert everyone to the white Christian nationalist way of thinking and believing. Because what I never heard was use politics, create legislation that is like Jesus. I never heard be like Jesus when you become a legislator. Be like Jesus when you're working in the political world. It was always what we could do for the religion, for Christianity, that version of Christianity, right? And so I think that's where you start to know, are we about violence or are we about peace? Because if we're a group of people that truly believe in following Jesus, Jesus was an activist. Jesus was a political criminal. Jesus was accused of violence to the point that he was put to death, right? And so I think that, what I worry about as I transitioned out of the cult, I fought so hard to get out of that, by the way. And so it's been extremely painful on a personal level for me and other actual cult survivors that were in the thick of it to see it take over our nation. And I cannot emphasize enough the dangers behind things like the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, because it's straight out of our cult playbook. In fact, the Heritage Foundation were key players and partners of my organizational affiliations as a child, as a teenager, and of people like my parents and others in leadership. So this is very real, and it's very, very important to identify, who are the folks we're working against and what are their strategies. And what I find really interesting is, as I got out of that thought, that group think, the brainwashing and indoctrination, when I entered liberal, I'm not a liberal anymore, by the way, but when I entered liberal Christian circles, they were like, what are you doing? You're political? You're an activist? We don't do that here. We're neutral. And this was in liberal Christian circles. And that was a major wake-up call for me, because we are fighting a battle. We want peace, right? Peace is the goal. We didn't start the battle. I don't want to be fighting a battle, but there are people fighting a battle against us and against peace. So we have to figure out what we are willing to do to combat that, right? And as peaceful people and as people who want peace, I hold space that can be very complex. That can be quite complicated. But if we want peace to win, we have to be a part of taking the steps to make that peace. And we need clergy, and we need pastoral students, and we need faith organizers that are willing to wrestle with these questions so that they then go and take the actions and are involved. One of the people I grew up with that was taught, this Christian nationalist thinking, this takeover and, get everyone to believe what we believe about women, about the patriarchy, about queerness is wrong, trans people shouldn't be here, all these things. Her name is Jenna Ellis, and if you don't know who that is, she was an attorney for Donald Trump in his first term. And she's one of the most prominent people from how I grew up. But there are tons of people that grew up like I did that have never deconstructed, reconstructed, done any kind of their own construction, that are in government all over this country, involved in politics, whether it be at places like the Heritage Foundation, whether it be in church pulpits, using that platform to advance their own theological preferences and beliefs. So my question to you is, will you choose to use your current and future platforms to do the work of advancing peace? Will you understand that it's not a choice of whether we intermingle these things? They are already intermingled. And if you're a Jesus follower like me, yes, even after growing up in a cult, I have found my way back to Jesus somehow. I have a very unique relationship with him these days, but a relationship nonetheless. But will you join me in having a relationship with him and following in his example of promoting peace, promoting liberation to the point that it might cost you something?
Thank you. I have done a lot of speaking before pastors. And one of the things I say to them is, do not be apologetic in talking about issues of justice and compassion. Because so many pastors will, in some way, be speaking about an issue and then get into a long line of defense. Because they know some people in the congregations are upset that they would be talking about rights, or they would be talking about issues of conflict. They would be talking about things in which there's division within their church. And I said, don't be apologetic about that, because your effort to go into that kind of an apologetic explanation is to suggest this isn't really baked into what it means to be a follower of Jesus. It's to suggest I'm nervous about what I'm focusing upon, and I just want you to be gracious in hearing what I have to. No. If you believe something and you're convicted about it, speak out of that, because you could spend more than a day, much less a sermon time. You could spend a lifetime trying to convince people about something that they have no interest in being convinced about, but have them to experience you and your conviction. And maybe they want to talk about this later, not when they're arguing with you or they're thinking about it. And maybe you'll go into more depth, but it's likely you'll never exhaust speaking about the reality that things that are physical are spiritual, and things that are spiritual are physical. And they are intertwined, and I don't think you ever really deal with one without the reality being that which is also being addressed of the other. The second thing I would say is some people are not, no, I'll change that. Some Christians are not interested in following Jesus. They're interested only in following a Jesus that they have made into their own image. And it's important to recognize that when you speak about following Jesus, you are likely having many, many images of this Jesus come up in people's minds, because Bruce Barton wrote a book in the 1930s, The Man Nobody Knows. And it was about a Jesus who he said is misunderstood because the Jesus that nobody knows was a successful businessman. And the primary text that conveys this identity for Jesus is Jesus saying, I must be about my Father's business. Oh, no. And he portrays Jesus as someone who is successful, affluent, someone who women love to follow, someone who was inspirational and analogous to a very successful Wall Street person. So this tells you just one of the ways in which Jesus gets remade all the time. Clarence Jordan, a New Testament scholar, said, people would rather worship Jesus than to follow Jesus. it's also important to recognize that so much of what we're talking about in terms of religion and social engagement relates to tribal identity. My race, my ethnicity, my social standing, my privilege, my power. And anytime we divorce those realities from the kinds of things we're talking about, I think we're going to miss out a powerful force that is not only operative in the society, it's operative for each one of us in this room. To what tribes do you belong? And to what tribes are you comfortable identifying? And how is there diversity even within your tribe? One of the questions I've asked my students over all these years, and in the classes it's predominantly white student, I would ask, what does it mean to be white? And by and large, the students fall silent. How do you give expression to what it means to be your race? And what does it mean when others sitting around you, their whole lives have had to wrestle with the question of race, and they hear you say, I have nothing to say about what it means to be white? So how are we taking seriously our own identities and our own difficulty in crossing identity boundaries? To confess that we have some dis-ease in crossing an identity boundary because we're not clear how we're going to be received and how we will be interpreted. And how do we understand the importance of crossing anyway, and perhaps suffering being rejected or suffering other things that burden our hearts, but recognizing this is what it means to be the human community. And if we are not willing to cross identity boundaries with one another, what promise is there for beloved community? Because in crossing identity boundaries, we're also willing to admit the importance of being in conflict. And so often, our failure to cross an identity boundary is because we're not comfortable with conflict. This is true with the activists. So what kind of training are you getting with conflict and how you deal with it? I think it's crucial. Recognizing my own need for that, I did mediation training, and it enabled me to attend to some things in anxiety. And this is after I'd done community organizing and protests and all of this. But there are different levels of conflict that require different skills that we're not necessarily born with. How are you taking seriously finding places that can cultivate your skills in conflict? Because it's not just conflict in dealing with people who think differently than you. A lot of the conflict is with people who agree with you. Both in the civil rights movement and every movement I've been part of, you have to struggle with people who have the same goals that you have, but who don't have the same strategy that you have. How do you attend to that with one another? And just for the sake of time, and I know we want questions, I'll say, taking seriously how I'm dealing with me can be as crucial as how I'm dealing with somebody else. And how am I giving myself to the kind of spiritual disciplines and spiritual communities that are cultivating my capacity in this peacemaking of beloved community? How am I taking seriously, oh, I'm against violence, but I don't have any nonviolent skills? How am I taking seriously the complexity of nonviolence? How am I taking seriously that just a nonviolent procedure in itself is not that which is necessarily going to deliver, because authoritarian regimes practice nonviolence in sustaining their authoritarian regimes? It's these kinds of issues and questions that I think take us to places of transformation where we continually find ourselves in a pattern of growth, not completion, but growth. And we begin to accept that our efforts don't necessarily change the world once and for all, but things do change. And sometimes what has most changed by being involved and engaged is me. There's a depth of myself that is discovered. Oftentimes, when we have failed in getting what we've wanted, but we've still stood and came back. I worked for juvenile reform in Georgia for 6 and 7 years, and for 6 years we cried. But in that 7th year, we got what was called a model juvenile justice reform. But what happens is you get something you fought for, and then the other elements of it come forth as where's the problem, because Georgia has something like 157 counties. And in this state with 157 counties, the resources for many of these counties are not the same resources that are in metropolitan Atlanta and metropolitan Savannah and metropolitan Macon and metropolitan Augusta. They're very different. And then you begin to weep to discover the very thing you fought for 7 years runs into roadblocks throughout much of the state. But what does that then mean for your commitment to go forward in juvenile justice reform? This is where to have a proper grief and a vision that is not defeated by disappointment is crucial. And the last thing I'll then ask is, what are your practices of celebration for sustaining your vision, for sustaining your involvement? How do you experience joy with one another, especially with food? Because if you're meeting too much without food, that's not right. You're not going to get very far. And how do you take seriously how food and being together can help in crossing an identity boundary? How do you take seriously the power of music and the power of art and the power of questions and the power of crying when you don't have words to give expression to what you're crying? How do you take seriously these opportunities to be sustained in the journey? These are the kinds of things that I would hope that the younger you are involved in it, the more it will serve you along the way. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your insights. I really wish that we could just continue having this conversation, but I do want to keep us on time this afternoon. I would encourage you all, if you have questions, to please approach our panelists after and engage with them in conversation. I really wish that we could take questions, but again, I think we should keep ourselves moving through this afternoon.